Hi, it's Kirby. This is a patron-only podcast. And today we're going to be talking about the connection between Elizabeth Short, known to the world, sadly, as the Black Dahlia, and Rachel Chandler's family. And frankly, it extends to Rachel Chandler herself. I want to thank those of you who are new here to my Patreon and you're still sort of catching up and listening and all of that. Uh, Today is December the 3rd, and I had been wanting to upload this little slice of history that gets pushed down because of the people involved. However, I thought that I would share it with you guys because on this platform, I can share things that I cannot share on YouTube because this is I don't know. I think it's more jarring to people. And so anyway, here we go. On a seemingly normal Wednesday morning on January 15, 1947, the naked body of a woman was found by Betty Bersinger, who was walking past a vacant lot with her 3-year-old daughter. It was a gruesome sight, and initially Betty believed she was looking at a store mannequin. The skin of the woman on the ground was almost white. The murderer had drained the blood out of her body. Furthermore, she had been cut in half with her torso 1 foot away from the lower part of her body. The killer clearly took his time arranging the dismembered pieces to be seen in a particular manner. Her hands were placed over her head, her legs were spread far apart, her uterus and entrails were removed and placed under her buttocks. Her face was maimed, with the edges of her mouth etched into an eerie grin. To remove forensic evidence, the cold-blooded murderer brushed her body with gasoline. She was identified as the 22-year-old woman known as Elizabeth Short by the LAPD. So the reason they were able to identify her body was because in 1942, at the age of 18, she had been arrested for underage drinking, and her prints were taken at the time. And at this moment in history, the police were beginning to use fingerprints. So this helped the authorities identify who had been, sort of murdered in such a very vicious and horrifying way. Elizabeth was one of 5 daughters born in Hyde Park, Massachusetts. Her parents, Cleo and Phoebe Short, moved to Medford, Massachusetts, in order that Cleo could continue earning a living, designing and building miniature golf courses. So they weren't poor. However, when the Great Depression hit in 1929, he split. He left the family, he left his wife, he forgot about his children. So apparently he did well, but the mother, as is typically the case when the bread earner leaves the family with no additional financial support, especially during the Great Depression. So now they were a family that was in dire need and became, sort of like the sort of families that we see where it's easy for predatory behavior to sneak into the children, right? And the mother, frankly. So Elizabeth grew up to be a pretty girl and became enamored of what she saw on the silver screen. She had dreams of becoming a film star, and so with that in mind, she moved to California. And although she was able to get a couple of jobs as a model, her acting career did not take off. She fell for 2 men whom she believed she would marry. However, these 2 relationships, they didn't pan out either. She was vulnerable. She had little to no income, and basically she did become, as I kind of alluded to, the ideal prey for men who simply wanted to let's say, have a fling with, okay? So on January 9th, 1945, she planned to return to Massachusetts. So she was going to go home. But before leaving, she made plans to meet her sister at the Biltmore Hotel in Hollywood. So I want to just say that the Chandler family built the Biltmore Hotel. And they built it, as I describe in my book, Chasing Chandler. They built it on um, sort of like the remains of humans, and it was sort of a blood-soaked area. Um, Let me see if I have my notes here about how that was built, because I do have it in my book. Well, what I remember, and I'm just going to do this by. So they had already begun, the Chandlers, building over spilt blood and dead bodies. They did this when the building where they kept their newspaper, the Los Angeles Times, was blown up. When they were rebuilding, some of the men, now there was like no unions to protect workers. And so when they were building that, as the bodies fell into the open pit, the Chandlers were like, just keep working, keep working. And so they basically built the Los Angeles Times building with these dead bodies under it. And when they were in the process of building the Biltmore Hotel, they had as much consideration for the dead workers of men who fell to their death. And these are unsafe conditions, I mean, the conditions for anyone who was in the construction industry, who was a worker, were poor to non-existent. So the bodies of the men who fell to their death were left to rot beneath the surface of the 11-story tower that we now know as the Biltmore Hotel. And the Biltmore is where Elizabeth Short was last seen. Now, this gets even more interesting because two more Chandlers will be connected to the Black Dahlia. And then she disappeared. They saw her making phone calls in that lobby, and then she vanished. So over 150 suspects were questioned, but no one was arrested. However, among the list of men was Norman Chandler. He was the new editor of the Los Angeles Times when his father, Norman Chandler, who married into Otis Chandler, Otis's life. So Colonel Otis was actually the first generation of the LA Times newspaper, followed by Harry, whose first wife died after giving birth. And then somehow he ended up, and he was not well off, but somehow he ended up becoming Otis's step well, what do you call a stepson, right? No, not a son-in-law. Son-in-law. Mind you, I haven't had any morning coffee, so, and suddenly became the heir to this great fortune because Otis was a blue blood. And if you've read the Chasing Chandler book that I've put out a couple of years ago and then followed it with a second edition some months ago, then you would know that. So he was on the list of suspects. He's somebody, the Chandlers, just for a quick sort of condensed history, they attended the secret gatherings at Bohemian Grove when the Grove was a thing, right? And they endlessly backed Republicans. In Daniel Wolf's book, The Mob, the Mogul, and the Murder that Transfixed Los Angeles, he alleges that Norman had gotten Elizabeth Short pregnant and that he'd hired the mobster Bugsy Siegel to kill her. And by this time, the wealthy publishing company and organized crime had a very nice marriage of convenience. Many viewed the Chandlers as thugs in business suits. And to go a step further, Wolf claims this happened, that he impregnated her when Short was working as a call girl for Brenda Allen. So let me tell you a little bit about Brenda Allen. She was considered Hollywood's top madam, and she had a roster of well-known clients, including Hollywood actors, wealthy businessmen, and powerful politicians. She ran her operation from a single-story house in West Hollywood, so that, she wanted to be as unobscure, sort of very obscure. It wasn't like a fancy house. When I put it into the distance between the Los Angeles Times and her house in West Hollywood, it's basically just a 20-minute drive. So Harry could have very easily gone back and forth there. And I'll tell you what else. He had a heliport similar to what Robert Maxwell would later have in England, on top of the media empire that he was handed by intelligence, but a little more on that on another day. So he had a heliport built onto the Times building, and he would jump into the helicopter to avoid traffic jams. So journalist John Babcock wrote that Los Angeles was run by a sleazy shadow government created by the Chandlers. So here we have the Chandlers creating the sort of entity that we have been referring to as the shadow government. And he claimed that this included gamblers, swindlers, bootleggers, and con men. And Carl Greenberg, who worked for both the Examiner and the Times, wrote there were houses of prostitution all over town and gambling joints. Slot machines could be found in the rear of many restaurants. Pinball machines that paid off in cash helped pay the rent in many small business establishments. And bookies were basically tripping over each other to get a slice of that. And the Chandlers did place crooked politicians into positions of power, and they were known for using the Los Angeles Police Department as their personal police force. So on the morning of May 4th, 1948, the Chandler family newspaper ran the headline, "Names found in vice rates set Hollywood agog." Basically similar to what we're seeing in the Sean Combs case, right? It's making mainstream media news. And so when Brenda Allen's bordello was raided and the protection given to her by the police and members of the underworld sort of were pulled out from under her, suddenly they were talking about her ring, okay? And yeah, I was able to comb through the FBI files back to that moment in time, and let me tell you, that took effort. And written on index cards were the most intimate details, details, okay, of approximately 250 men. This information, as the information in the Epstein case, as the information in the Sean Combs case, well, this was confiscated by the Los Angeles Police Department. And as is often the case, it was the last the public heard about the well-known clientele. That said, I did collect a couple of names. And while I have a long list here, I'll just name some that might be more familiar to you. So we have Jim Fleming, who was a very close friend of Errol Flynn, who was one of the first big-time actors. We have George Jessel, who was the producer in 20th Century Fox. We have Zappo Marx of the Marx Brothers. Yes. We have Hal Roach Jr., again, another big name for those of you who are Hollywood buffs, Mickey Rooney, Orson Welles, and the list continues. Representing Brenda Allen was Max Solomon, which was the same attorney for Bugsy Siegel and other mobsters such as Mickey Cohen. So we have right there the fact that Solomon was representing Brenda Allen as a very good substantiating evidence to connect Norman Chandler to the very likely possibility that he was behind the gruesome. I mean, it's just such a horrifying just to think about the Black Dahlia and what happened to her. So Allen had gotten her start while working at another white sex slave ring run by Anne Forrest, who was known as the Black Widow. In the end, Allen was found guilty and things seemed to calm down until it had been discovered that she was paying LAPD officers protection money. Now, clearly, she wasn't the only one paying protection money. All the establishments were paying protection money. One of the detectives in the case, a man by the name of Jackson, and I'll just leave it there, reported directly to the police chief. And the police chief at the time was Clements B. Horrell, and he was basically her lover and her partner in crime. So we have seen this time and time again where we see members of the local police force. We saw this in the Franklin case where a person who was a police officer became involved with a victim. We see here that one of the detectives who was basically in quote investigating the so-called ring that Chandler and all of these movie stars and heads of studios would go to, well, suddenly it was slipped out. Somebody, these things when news slips out that starts making headlines, it's basically a tactic to help you look there and not here. So suddenly your focus is moved to another shiny object, let's say, instead of keeping your eye on the ball. So in a separate case, mobster Mickey Cohen, one of Bugsy Siegel's cohorts, claimed that Detective Jackson and Police Lieutenant Rudy Wellpot had been shaking him down for years. Cohen had made recordings of conversations between Allen and Jackson from his office at the LAPD headquarters. Only at this point did LAPD show signs of strain because they were actually caught, I mean, they were bugged. So this bugging and recording and videotaping, this is not new to either the Epi case or the Sean Diddy, Puffy, Love Combs, whatever he wants to call himself. This has been going on forever. And so while researching, Rachel Chandler's history, I came across article length reviews debunking the work of the author who connected Harry Chandler to Elizabeth Short. And it kind of reminded me of what was being written in order to mislead the public during the arrest of Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell later, and what's happening now in the Combs case. A lot of false and misleading news. And of course, who's in a better instance than a publishing company to have access to writers? And we know the CIA utilized authors to write false news for our consumption. In any event, between what appears to have been a concerted effort to clear Norman Chandler's name as the Black Dahlia's killer and the assertions by Steve Hodel, a retired LAPD detective claiming his father, George Hodel, was the killer, I kind of knew I had stumbled onto a larger piece of the Chandler family puzzle. Okay. Um, then later, when the Balenciaga scandal opened, I believe 2 years ago, it could have been two, could have been three, where, they had the children posing with BDSM clothing with the teddy bears, and everybody started to talk about that. I started looking at Rachel Chandler's friends. One of them, a woman by the name of Lata, had worked for Balenciaga. She was a Russian-born stylist, and in her Instagram was an image that I initially used as the cover of Chasing Chandler, showing a woman on the ground posed exactly like Elizabeth Short's body was found, severed in half. And so this direct reference to her friend Rachel about her grandfather's role was not lost on me. Okay. Um, in closing, I just want to say, because I did mention Balenciaga, that on August of 2021, Justin Bieber was announced as the new face for Balenciaga. So the brand continues to be accused of trying to normalize the PD, you know what, and however, I wonder how many of you had heard that Chandler's family had been involved in this infamous case that will be forever analyzed for many years to come. Okay, guys, talk soon. Bye.